Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to our first webinar on Teachers' Pension Scheme and Independent Schools in Scotland. If hopefully you find this session valuable, it will be available to share after the event as well. There's also, as part of the session, if in your screen, there's a little box at the top with a question. So if you want to ask questions either at the end or on the way through, I'll pick those up at the end of the presentation slides. So if we kick off, I'll put the screen on, and we'll kick off straight away with the slides. So good afternoon. I'm David Davison from Spence Partners. We're a firm of consulting actuaries and pension consultants, and I head a practice within the business that advises charities and not-for-profit organisations. A lot of experience working with public sector multi-employer type arrangements, such as sort of Teachers' Pension Scheme, and indeed with a number of schools in Scotland. I've also got involvement via ICAS, Charity Finance Group, and PLSA in sort of issues around multi-employer pension schemes, such as sort of teachers' pension. And obviously I've already worked and carried out exercises with schools in England, so sort of trying to bring to bear that sort of experience today. So what I'm going to cover is just some background around the sort of what's been happening, some drivers for change in England and Wales, experience that I've had from the schools and the staff consultation. So some lessons for Scottish schools if they're considering a review exercise. Then some ideas around sort of next steps, the implementation, timing and costs. And as I say, I'll pick up any questions that are raised as part of the area at the end of the presentation. So in terms of England and Wales, just as sort of background, sort of the Department for Education, March 2019, was suggesting there's about 2,000 independent schools in England, with about 1,300 contributing to Teachers' Pension Scheme. Other research suggests that's about sort of 1,100. So so a bit difficult actually sort of trying to get all the sort of detailed information, suggesting that there was about 80 had left since 2018. With a further 107 intimating they were leaving towards the end of last year. So I'd expect we've got somewhere in the region of about 200 who have left over the sort of the relatively recent period, which is also picked up in part of the sort of press comment and so on there. And I'm sure you'll have picked up most of this sort of stuff yourself, but you know, it's been getting quite high profile, and some major organisations leaving. But also some problems around sort of strikes and threat of strikes from the withdrawal of the scheme, and some of that certainly links to sort of experience I've had around the sort of exercises in different regions and so on as well. So in terms of in England and Wales, obviously the sort of Teachers' Pension Scheme, similar in Scotland, unfunded pension scheme, which obviously means there's no pension fund there. The current contributions pay for pensioners' benefits on the way through the exchequer. Benefits are provided on a final salary basis up until April 2015, and then changed to a care basis, which is consistent with all other sort of public sector schemes around that time. Provides obviously sort of pension benefits, but also sort of lump sum tax-free cash. You've got to give up part of your pension in terms of actually getting that access to that cash at a conversion rate, which in the current market is actually quite expensive. The employee contributions range between about 7.4% and 11.7% depending on salary, and different retirement ages across each of those sort of various sort of funding categories. Between 60 and state pension age, depending on the sort of benefit category of the individual and the retirement age. The scheme also provides death and service benefits with a 3 times salary lump sum benefit, spouse's pension on death pre-retirement, a retirement grant post-retirement, ill health retirement benefits, and all of those additional death and service benefits are included within the contribution. Obviously, one of the big benefits of sort of teachers' pension scheme is around the sort of continuity of the benefit, and that obviously if teachers leave and move different schools, they can continue in the same pension scheme. So needless to say, with those benefits and so on, it's considered a very valuable part of overall teachers' package. In England, obviously from September 2019, the employer contributions increased from 16.48 to 23.68, and that the 16.48 already gone up over 2% from the sort of 2016 figures effectively. So an increase this time about 43%. So that was putting an extra cost of about 72,000 a year on the per million of salary roll. And most of the exercises I've seen, the increases have been in excess of about 200 to 300,000 pounds a year. So obviously very material increase within sort of constrained budgets. The increases were all based on the GAD valuation at March 2016, and obviously the next GAD valuation is due after sort of 4 years, which is 31st of March 2020. So taking into account current market conditions. Obviously, in terms of the funding, there's no certainty of the cost. The contributions obviously can change. The other issue is one around the sort of McLeod judgment, where there was a protection provided to pensioners or to staff within 10 years of retirement, which has since proved to be illegal. And there's going to be sort of compensation required to actually level out those benefits across everyone actually in the scheme. So there's likely to be an increased cost as a result of that. And obviously, as in terms of sort of funding, as you mentioned, the next valuation, market conditions haven't been particularly favourable at 31st March, so that could increase costs further potentially. One of the benefits, obviously, of the unfunded schemes is at this stage there's no cessation cost to exit the teachers' pension scheme, unlike funded public sector schemes where there would be quite a large payment to actually allow you to exit the scheme. So in terms of the sort of engagement with schools and so on initially, around the sort of consultation requirements, the first thing I think anyone needs to look at is obviously what do your contracts of employment say, and what's actually being promised to staff. So is there a specific sort of mention to sort of staff in terms of the teachers' pension scheme, and what that's going to potentially, whether that's going to require sort of a formal change. In terms of any consultation, if you employ more than 50 staff, so that's in total, not just in the pension scheme, then the pension regulator suggests statutory consultation of 60 days minimum around changes to defined benefit pensions or material changes to defined contribution as well. So this would fit in that category. Less than 50 employees, it's a voluntary consultation, but I would expect most organisations, regardless, to be doing a consultation of at least 60 days around of this given the magnitude of any proposed change and the impact it'd be. Obviously, the sort of the backup around this, that any consultation process, the objective is to have all staff agree to the change in contractual terms, and to date, fortunately, we've sort of managed to sort of achieve that. But it has, some processes have been difficult, and sometimes it's necessary to extend the consultation process. And obviously the last resort is then using a dismissal and re-engagement process, where the contract is actually changed with the pension benefit removed. And again, in terms of timing, you need to sort of take into account that obviously the dismissal period around 1 term notice for teachers, to actually sort of manage the sort of time scale in terms of consulting with the teachers over any sort of change. The experience in terms of sort of engagement with boards, I've sort of found that, you know, the question sort of how much financial modelling has already been carried out. In my experience, sort of mostly there has been quite a lot, and the school has got to the position where it's almost looked at every other contingency or alternative that could be looked at. But obviously sort of making sure that the more detailed that analysis actually is, the better, in terms of actually putting any proposals to teachers for any level of change. The other thing is, it's probably important to get an understanding of the experience of your board, because also my experience is that the board are very much front and center of this communication, and having a sort of an experienced board and a united front in terms of presenting any changes is hugely valuable. And I've had mixed experience around that, you know, in terms of certainly very experienced and slightly less experienced boards. Again, identifying conflicts and how you're actually going to manage those through any sort of review process. Ultimately, also collecting sort of detailed member information so that that's available for some of the bits of the exercise I'll talk about in a second. Consider the design of the replacement scheme, and also death and service costs, because obviously, as I said, all the existing costs are included, whereas if you're putting in a new defined contribution scheme, for example, death and service costs will be on top of the cost of that, so actually sort of managing what those are actually likely to be. The other thing I've mentioned there is that it's probably sensible in any new scheme design to ensure that the employee contribution cost is below what people are paying at the moment as an option. They might want to increase it above that, but below as a starting point, because it's quite a difficult message actually going to employees saying that we're reducing the value of your benefit, but we're also taking higher contributions for it. So it might be that they want to pay those higher contributions, but don't set a higher contribution above what employees are actually paying at the moment as the base level of contribution. Also, I think it's worth considering some sort of profiling around the sort of membership and how it might actually impact on different levels of staff in different schools, because that can help in terms of the messaging actually as well, and I'll mention that in a bit more detail in a second. All of this obviously requires time and quite a bit of planning, and certainly experience is if this is tried to push through too quickly, it really can cause a lot of mistrust and animosity. I was saying about the benefit modelling, and one of the things we've looked at around this is, so this is like sort of a model just saying, well, if we look at categories at different age levels and different service periods within the school, then depending on what level of pension scheme is provided going forward, looking at what the sort of replacement ratio is, so how much effectively are teachers losing as a result of actually any change in benefit. So this one, you can see that it very significantly varies across ages. So, you know, up towards the end at retirement, it makes almost no difference because most people have built up the vast majority of their benefits. Down at the bottom, it doesn't really sort of make it that much difference because the projected values over the longer term are better, but it can make a significant impact in the middle range, you know, sort of maybe benefits coming down there as low as maybe sort of 60% of what people were getting before, and sort of maybe sort of between about sort of 70 and 80% for the majority in that sort of middle band. So it's obviously sort of trying to manage the communication actually around that. And obviously that work also allows you to design the pension scheme in such a way to actually sort of try and minimize that as much as possible. In terms of then the lessons learned, the consultation timing has got to be sort of driven by the objectives, the dismissal and re-engagement timing process, and the amount of preparation that's actually completed, as well as I suppose by the finances in terms of the need to actually make cost savings if that's the driver. So I think, you know, you really have to sort of try and work out a realistic project plan to allow for all of the factors. The one thing I would sort of say as a huge sort of recommendation almost is that, you know, as much engagement with staff pre the consultation to consider a range of options is valuable. You're really trying to build a sort of a team approach in terms of saying, we've got this issue, we've got this financing issue. These are the sorts of things we want to look at, even sort of setting up sort of working party and so on to do it, to sort of try and avoid them and us type scenarios. I think also getting the board to sort of understand how far they want to go, or how far they can afford to go in terms of the new scheme and replicating the existing benefits. So really clear budget setting, and as much as possible, transparency, keeping everything as open and transparent as possible. In terms of the sort of member sort of engagement, the member sort of communication, the consultation document that goes out at the start really sort of sets the tone, I think, for the member engagement. So that really has to cover some background around what's being considered and so on, and the proposal, what it is, and why you're proposing any change. Probably outlining the difference between defined benefit and defined contribution, in that most organisations would move to a defined contribution scheme to provide certainty of contributions. So understanding that as well. Outlining what alternatives have been considered to date. Really trying to focus in on how the change affects individuals, how does the consultation process work and the timing around that, and also where support is available. So whether that's professional support provided by the school, or what's actually just generically available as part of any sort of pension review exercise. And obviously making sure that you have any sort of legal advice requirements in place to sort of support all that as well. There'll be a need to engage with sort of trade unions, and certainly the trade unions expect a meaningful consultation. Pretty much all of the sessions I did, there was trade union representatives attending those sessions and taking very detailed notes and having meetings and so on afterwards. So again, getting those, getting an understanding of that and what the expectations actually are around that as well is valuable. Then really doing sort of an initial staff briefing very quickly after the consultation goes out, to set out the process and sort of answer initial questions. Then a few weeks probably after that, providing very detailed member presentations in terms of sort of comparisons, and the option of sort of member one-to-ones to actually look at specific circumstances which people might not want to actually discuss in open forum. One of the things also that we found hugely valuable in these is actually providing comparative illustrations to people, which is giving them a personal impact on the cost and benefit of any change, and providing a fair comparison between the sort of before and after position, so that people, even if it represents a relatively large change, at least it means that they're aware and can actually sort of plan for it. The member illustration that we use, one of the things I identified very early is that people have a much greater fear and a much greater concern about what the likely impact is than often what the actual impact is. So really being able to tell them in detail how it's directly affecting them is really valuable, and also makes the exercise much more transparent. It also highlighted, doing those presentations and going through the illustrations, the huge lack of understanding of the existing scheme and how it works. So that I think helped as well. So I think sort of staff will want an indication of how the change will directly affect them, and in my view, using sort of uniform or sort of sample illustrations doesn't work. It really has to be detailed to actually give that sort of personal information. So I think providing those bespoke illustrations provides a base level of understanding and comparison. As an example, this is an idea, the sort of material that we actually sort of cover in terms of how the benefits have built up, what level of benefits have been available to date, and ultimately, if you didn't make any change, what the percentage of the benefits that you'd actually get in the future would be. Then looking at if you make certain sort of contribution levels, which are obviously bespoke to each organisation, what the comparison with that projected benefit level actually might be. And again, staff can compare that with their current salary as a percentage. Also going into the detail of things like, as I said, the conversion rate of cash within the scheme is quite expensive. So therefore, whenever you actually do the comparison on pension, it does look materially worse than if you do a comparison on cash and pension. So we actually provide that as well, because that particularly if you're paying reasonably good levels of contribution, that can actually get the figures between the two actually quite close. Then also looking at where there's the option of sort of individuals being able to take additional lump sum cash rather than pension, so being able to take their benefits in a slightly different format. So again, we'd provide information on that, and that would be part of the sort of staff presentation. And then also comparing the level of contribution actually being paid for each individual. So what the net cost would be on salary of the existing scheme versus any proposals. And as I say, what you can see from this is the proposals, the base level proposals are suggesting contributions below what's being paid at the moment. So there's a net saving which allows people to actually increase contributions up to the same level if they actually want to, but they're not actually forced into doing that at stage one. I think the other things are the starting point, the sort of lessons learned from the sort of staff consultation as well, were that there were a lot of suggestions during the early stages of the sort of the presentation in terms of what alternatives could be used or could be done to sort of avoid changing the pension scheme. Most of them, pretty much all of them, were generally impractical. You know, sort of organisations that utilise reserves, increase fees, reduce the admin costs. There was quite a strong desire to actually sort of try and reduce sort of support numbers and so on, see if the savings could be made that way. Some discussions around rationalise available lessons and so on. So I think this sort of highlights why my sort of suggestion in terms of getting working parties and sort of teachers involved early in terms of actually looking at all the options, and obviously sort of making sure that by the time the consultation goes out, all of the potential options have been really sort of thoroughly considered. So as I say, a working group would consider those issues in advance would be beneficial. Getting a sort of a collaborative sort of team approach, I think, would be sort of valuable as well. Again, the comment there was a very fundamental misunderstanding about the scheme work and how the scheme worked in most of the presentations. So that that sort of created unrealistic expectations, and therefore that needed a bit of time to actually sort of clarify through the process. Obviously, different individuals also have different objectives, so you tended to get quite a lot of that coming out in responses to the presentations and so on as well. And as I say, detailed benefit comparison considered valuable as a benefit impacted across so many areas, you know, depending on age, salary, past service, whether people wanted to retire at their normal retirement date or early retire, you know, the value of tax-free cash and so on, or value of other savings even were some of the things that came up in the sort of one-to-ones. So that certainly trying to sort of get a process that deals with those is valuable. The two of the other ones that were actually, I think, that can be headed off sort of or looked at sort of head on, I think, and actually are also trying to manage the communication as much as possible. You know, really thinking about that, because there was certainly, in my experience, quite a lot of sort of Chinese whispers going on with sort of people in small groups discussing things, and you tended to get people who thought they had an understanding of one or two issues, who were spreading that information to other people when actually it wasn't necessarily correct. So I think trying to make sure that you manage that as much as possible as part of the process. And also I think the other thing was obviously just the sort of the threat of resignation and how realistic that is. If individuals, you know, if the benefit is removed, will individuals just go somewhere else, and what would be the potential impact on the school? So understanding what other schools are doing, and obviously the availability of what I described as good rules in state schools, because I think in certainly from the experience of sort of other exercises, there was a lot of that in terms of sort of threat, but there didn't seem to be sort of a lot of available rules as comparisons. So again, sort of probably sort of trying to get an understanding of that. So in terms of then the sort of future scheme options, I think sort of what option one is a reduced employer cost to teachers' pension scheme. This is sort of in England become known as the sort of Taunton option after a school in Taunton in Somerset. Effectively what they did was they looked at increasing the contributions payable to the teachers scheme by the teachers, so that they weren't just paying their personal contribution, but they were making a salary sacrifice in order to maintain access to teachers' pension scheme. So to give you an example how that might work, on the left-hand side you have the sort of pre-sacrifice figure, the sort of £30,000 salary, contributions at 8.6 for that employee, and employer at 16.48. The income tax, NIC, and the take-home pay. So the take-home pay is about 21,976 on that salary, and the total pension payment was about just over £7,000. So total employer cost 37,871. If the individual was to give up £1,900 of gross salary, then their pension contribution effectively would go up as a result of that. But obviously there's a tax and national insurance saving as a result of that, which reduces the net cost. So the total contribution pension payment goes up by the 7%, so the 7,000 up to 9,600, to actually sort of cover the new cost. Then the income tax, national insurance falls. So the employee's net take-home pay has gone down to about sort of 20,684, and the employer's cost is effectively exactly the same. So that allows you to continue, but effectively the teacher's paying a greater share of the contributions than as a sort of on a standard basis. And obviously what you could do with that is you could look at that on the basis of either a full cost for the benefit, or a shared cost, or some sort of staged cost. But obviously it needs quite a bit of work done in terms of actually identifying those contributions that you want to base it on. So obviously in that scenario, it's about a 7.2% increase in contributions, which is about £2,160, which gives you a salary reduction of 1,900, take-home pay reduced by £1,200 roughly, so about £100 a month, or 4%. Ideal time to look at that is at a salary review time, where the salary increase effectively could be negated. So you're actually sort of saying, well, we would be giving you a salary increase of X this year, but we're actually going to retain that to pay for those who want to stay in the teacher's pension scheme. As I say, you can then decide whether you want to sort of use all of it, or just look for part payment. It's obviously pretty complex. It varies by salary and contribution rate. So I think, and then what you can actually do is say, well, if employees aren't prepared to pay the extra, then they've got the option to opt out and go into a new defined contribution scheme, which fixes the cost. Obviously, the other thing about that is that if, as I suspect, costs may increase again in the future, it's a question of whether you then have to do that again, and also or whether you actually want to just draw a line in the sand and say, well, we're prepared to pick up the additional costs at this stage, but if those costs increase again in the future, then we're not prepared to do that, and we'll be looking at other ways of actually sort of trying to fund that. Option two, which has pretty much been the more popular option actually to date, has been around the sort of defined contribution scheme, because that gives you complete certainty of cost. You can then design the contributions based on what you actually need. So some of the options are, you could just say, okay, well, the contribution to the new scheme is X and Y, or you could say, well, we're prepared to pay the same contribution as the employee up to a certain level, or we're prepared to pay a multiple of the employee contribution up to a certain level. So, for example, the one I was showing there, the school had offered to pay 15% based on a 5% employee contribution. So the employee obviously could up that contribution if they wanted, but it wasn't compulsory. So anyone who was wanting to take a higher salary and have a lower pension contribution could do that. But a 20% pension contribution was still an attractive level of pension contribution. You obviously can then look at also things like, well, would it be worthwhile having a joining period for new teachers joining where they might have a slightly lower contribution, which would allow you to pay a higher contribution based on a longer period of service. So you've got sort of options around that. And again, that goes back to the sort of modelling in terms of trying to get the best outcome versus the existing scheme. And obviously the quality of the contributions that's actually being paid will impact on the new scheme selection, because the better the contributions and the better the rates in terms of pricing that you're going to get on the new scheme. Also need to consider the replacement risk benefit. So are you providing lump sum, death in service and critical illness? I think those are probably good benefits to actually maintain, because it's certainly, particularly the lump sum benefit is seen as a very high value. Or do you actually sort of offer some menu of flex benefits that has other options as well included, which I've noticed sort of some of the other schools have actually looked at as well. In terms of a new defined contribution scheme, you'd be looking at sort of these key issues really. So the pricing charges of the scheme, that's very much driven by the quality of the contributions. So the higher the contributions on average per staff member and in total, the better terms you're actually likely to get. Obviously, you'll want the provider that's very financially strong, providing likely to be about for a long time, has a good range of investment options and a good track record, quality administration, also sort of web support and so on that gives members sort of access to sort of their information online, and also whether they've got any other options such as on retirement, whether they allow sort of drawdown options or whatever on retirement. Also in terms of the transition, we'd be looking at what sort of some of the key transition issues on retirement actually, or on transfer actually are. And I've mentioned some of those already, things like the tax-free cash basis, death in service, whether people are wanting to early retire, and how you integrate the benefits between the two schemes for most effectively. In terms of out there at the moment as well, there are some schemes that have sort of branded themselves particularly for these sorts of exercises. So the Aviva Pension Trust for Independent Schools, which is a DC Master Trust. TPT Retirement Solutions also have the pension scheme for the education sector, which runs alongside the Independent Schools Pension Scheme. It's slightly different in that it offers defined benefit and defined contribution. Although, again, I think I would be wary about going into a defined benefit scheme outside the teacher's pension scheme, given that the additional risks, the costs of actually doing that, and also the fact that it effectively brings this exit debt issue into play, which isn't there in the teacher scheme. There's a lot of other defined contribution schemes available, and depending on whether there turns out to be a sort of a move in this market, it might be worth looking at a specific scheme for the Scottish market. So if we link some of that in terms of the findings into sort of almost like sort of a Scottish perspective, obviously in Scotland there's two schemes. There was the Scottish Teacher Superannuation Scheme, which was the final salary scheme, which closed back in from the 1st of April 2015, and then the Scottish Teachers Pension Scheme 2015, which is a care arrangement, which was set up after April 2015. The schemes are managed by the Scottish Public Pension Agency, SPPA, down in the Borders. Clearly very similar issues for schools in Scotland. The contribution revision, obviously, after the last valuation was slightly different based on slightly different sort of demographics. So the employer contributions were sort of 17.2 up to 23%, so about 58,000 per million salary roll. Employee contributions, sort of similar range, but sort of slightly different, 7.2 to 11.9. It's estimated that the McLeod impact that I mentioned earlier in terms of sort of the Scottish scheme is somewhere in the region of about £500 million. So that will be picked up as part of the next valuation when setting contributions. Obviously, sort of independent schools are eligible, but it's not compulsory that they actually join. And at March 2019, the number of employers in the Scottish schemes was said to be sort of 147, down by sort of 5 from 2018. So in terms of sort of conclusions and sort of key actions, really, in terms of, so, I think board engagement and sort of establishment of sort of key messages is really, really important, and sort of engagement with staff as much as possible in terms of actually sort of getting the right sort of messages. A very clearly documented sort of an audit trail in terms of sort of the steps taken, because in my experience, people will ask very, very detailed questions and want to actually, well, what did you consider as an alternative, and how much financial modelling was done around that, and what sort of impact did it actually have, and are there other ways of actually doing this? So really having strong answers to all of the questions that come up is going to be really valuable in moving the consultation forward. Have an agreed timetable and understanding where the sort of variables are and what might go wrong, or what how you might have to extend the timetable. For example, I've had experience where there was mostly sort of acceptance of sort of the change, but there was a few sort of hardcore who weren't prepared to accept the change. And the way I've actually sort of dealing with that, I think, was we sort of extended the timetable a bit to actually sort of do a bit more consultation, and ultimately we got acceptance on that. So I think it's really sort of trying to have some sort of contingency in there, that you're not felt like the whole change is actually being forced through and not properly considered. Obviously, some sort of legal input in terms of reviewing contracts and understanding the legal position, and that all the documents tick all the boxes around that actually as well. And then agreeing and designing all the member communication, and having a real sort of understanding of which bits are going to happen when, so that you try and avoid that, say, these sort of the point it was making about these sort of Chinese whispers at various points actually as well. In terms of key actions, then obviously you need to sort of select the new scheme design and provider if you're not going for something like a sort of a Taunton solution. Consider the death and service options, whether you're going to provide those, or if you're going to provide those, you could provide them in a slightly different format or higher amount. So for example, generally the 3 times death and service figure, you're probably looking at a sort of a salary roll cost somewhere between about 0.4 and 0.6% of salary roll for that, and maybe something slightly higher for the critical illness. So it's possible to actually provide 3 or 4 or 5 times, sort of within that sort of budgeting, depending on what the sort of cost envelope actually is. Also within the defined contribution scheme, looking at a salary sacrifice arrangement within that, because that very much improves, by doing it, the employee pension contributions by salary sacrifice, you save employee national insurance, employer national insurance, and Scottish band tax. So the only issue that the employer then needs to decide is whether, as part of the salary sacrifice, they give up all of the employer NI saving, or they give up part of it, or don't give up any of it. So again, that's part of the sort of design for the scheme actually initially. Looking at sort of delivering the sort of consultation, then obviously making sure you've got the right content and messages around that, and leaving yourself enough time to actually be able to do that. looking at the illustrations and what they need to contain and what information you're providing, the presentations and the engagement with members and how you actually go about doing that, whether members need sort of one-to-ones, whether you're providing sort of detailed Q&As. Again, most of the organisations we've been involved with have done quite detailed Q&As, so that, again, that was an assistance around the sort of Chinese whispers in terms of making sure that everyone had as much of the information as possible, as quickly as possible. And then once you've actually sort of gone through all that, then there's a question sort of implementing the proposal. So notifying the scheme members, establishing the new scheme, and actually making any contractual changes necessary within the timing actually as well. As an indication, you know, it's quite difficult to sort of say until you actually sort of see the detail of what's actually required. But from experience, I think, you know, you're looking at an exercise like this, looking at sort of actuarial, legal, project management type impact right through also sort of scheme selection and implementation. So you're probably looking at sort of a budget to do this somewhere between about £15,000 and £25,000, depending on what's actually needed. Obviously, if there's existing schemes in place and so on, which you can use, then that avoids the issue around scheme selection and so on as well, which actually will help in terms of costing. The other thing I suppose it's worth considering as well is there any scope for cooperation between schools? Because while you can't really use exactly the same comms, you can certainly design a template that can actually be worked for multiple and then worked away from that sort of basis, and providing sort of consistent messages. So it's certainly something to sort of consider as well. And I've worked in sort of similar ways with that with some with multiple employers and some other schemes actually as well, and it's proved to be quite effective. So I think just in terms of sort of finalising some comments in terms of the key messages, I think the key one at the top there is time is your friend. Start the process as early as you possibly can. I think the board need to engage and drive the process so that, you know, sort of really make sure that it's coming from them and with very rational thought through suggestions. Make sure there's a very clear and detailed audit trail of all the work that's been done. Certainly one of the exercises I did, the financial controller produced excellent documents in terms of, so whenever certain of the issues were raised about, well, we could do this or we could do this, she'd already produced a sort of a very detailed analysis of all of those things and the potential for sort of cost savings and so on. So, which was very powerful. Maximise engagement with the teachers pre-consultation. So potentially sort of looking at working parties, exploring other options, taking feedback. Avoiding them and us as much as possible. It's not going to be an easy decision to move, but certainly, you know, it's just sort of trying to smooth the process, even just length of time in terms of managing what I'd sort of describe as the grieving process, because people will find a change quite a shock, and actually it'll take a while to get used to it. So just trying to manage that with as much time through the process as possible. And then ultimately sort of refine and agree whatever sort of proposal. So it might be you want to make a certain set of proposals at the start, but know that there's actually other scope for other options actually later on, depending what the feedback actually is. Okay, so that was pretty much what I wanted to cover in terms of the session. I'll sort of close the slides down now, and I'm sort of happy to take any questions from people if they've got sort of points that they want me to cover.
There's one there, David. I don't know if you can see it. What were the main misunderstandings of how the TPS works?
Yeah, so I think one of the key ones was whenever we did the comparisons in particular was around how the benefits under care increased. So there was a very sort of significant focus on sort of, for example, increases in salary, and you know, so well our salary only goes up by 1% or 1.5% or whatever, without actually recognising that wasn't the way that the pension benefit now went up. That the pension benefit actually went up by almost as an underpin, as a floor. It went up by sort of at least inflation, so probably 2.5%. So that was one thing. There needed to be quite detailed explanations around the death and service benefits in particular. So I ended up sort of doing quite detailed comparisons so that people could actually see, well, this is the sort of the benefits in the teacher scheme compared to the new proposals. So that's an example of sort of some of them, but there was a number of them come out, even in the one-to-ones around other things around sort of early retirement and how the benefits across the different schemes actually sort of integrated and so on as well. Okay, I'm not seeing any other. Oh, are there any other? No.
No, not that I can see.
Okay.
There was.
Oh, okay.
I was going to say there was one asked earlier, but I posted a response to it. Somebody had just asked what GAD stood for, and that's Government Actuaries Department.
Okay. Okay. Well, I think that's hopefully what I wanted to cover. Obviously, everyone's got contact details. We'll be sort of sharing the session so that you can share it with other people in your organisations if you want to, in terms of the sort of the content. Or obviously if other people from organisations want to join the other session I'm doing next week, or if there's any specific questions that you want to ask, then just drop me a note. Okay, thanks very much for your time. Thanks, bye.